What's up everyone? This is episode 20 of Retro Buyer's Guide and I'm Mike. Today we're going to be taking a look at the RetroN 5, a handy little emulation machine that plays Mega Drive games, Genesis games, Super Nintendo, Super Famicom, NES, Famicom, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, all of that in one unit. It's manufactured by Hyperkin, and it plays most of the libraries of those game consoles I mentioned via Android emulation and upscales it to a very nice looking 720p. Here are the controller ports on the side. You can see you have one for a Sega Genesis, an NES, and a Super Nintendo controller. Something that's interesting is you can use any controller to play any of the console's libraries. So a Super Nintendo controller play Genesis games, for example. On the back here, you've got an SD card slot, your HDMI out, and a mini USB to charge the RetroN 5 controller, as well as the power supply. So let's go ahead and take a look at the console here. Let me go ahead and power it up. The first thing you'll see is this little splash screen that pops up every time as it's booting. And then you're going to be to the main menu. Here you can adjust settings for the individual games as well as the console itself. We'll get into that in a second. Let's go ahead and insert Mega Man 1 for the NES. So as you can see, it loads the game into the system's memory by actually dumping the ROM from the cartridge to the console. And from this point forward, it's not actually playing the game off of the console at all. It is emulating it. One of the benefits to this is it upscales the image to 720p, which looks really good on an HD TV. It also allows you to add several filters and the ability to turn on and off scan lines, which will give you that kind of retro feel while you're playing on an HD TV. As far as input lag, at least on the console's end, Hyperkin's done a pretty good job of minimizing that, and it's barely noticeable, if at all. I had no problems playing any action games that required quick reflexes, and I was even able to beat the Turbo Tunnel on Battletoads, which requires pretty quick reflexes to get past that level. So I think the input lag, meaning the time from when you press the button to when you see an action on the screen, it's very good for this particular machine. I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the menu options here, which I think are pretty cool. You can kind of customize the way that you want these games to look on your HD TV by pressing down and start within the menu. And what this does is it brings up your in-game menu. Here you can do things like save your state, load your state, add scan lines, which we'll do right here, take screenshots, change the volume, and so on and so forth. And I think the scan lines actually look pretty good. It kind of gives you that retro look. I know some people won't like it because it's not the real thing and it's not like exactly playing on a CRT, but if that's what you want, this machine is probably not for you in the first place. Let's take a look at a Sega Genesis game. I picked Shinobi 3 Return of the Ninja Master, one of my favorite Genesis games of all time. I'm going to go ahead and plug in the Sega Genesis controller here because I prefer to use the right controllers for the right consoles. And once we plug in the cartridge here in the top, you'll see the front of it flashing, and it is going to settle on the console that's playing. So you see there on the right, it highlighted the Sega Genesis controller. Real quick, let's take a look at the settings menu. This is where you can change your image filter, add scan lines, change your aspect ratio, display overscan, force original resolution. That one's kind of handy. Change your screen refresh rate or change the screen size. So there's a lot of customization within there. It's pretty neat that they included all those things. There's also a sound enhancement setting, which I don't really like. You can also apply cheats via the SD card, but you have to download them first, and they're not really clear on how you do that. And patches, which allow you to play translated games in English, which I think is bar none the best feature about the RetroN 5, which no one seems to be talking about. But that's basically what I use mine for, aside from save states and load states. Here is Shinobi 3, and as you can see, it looks great. I think the Genesis emulation on this is very nice. Actually, all of the emulation is pretty good, except I did run into some compatibility issues with some of the portable games, which I'll get into a little bit later. But for the most part, Hyperkin's claim of 100% compatibility it's been pretty reliable so far for me. I tested, quite a few games for each system on this console, and I didn't run into any issues except for, like I said, some of the Game Boy Color games didn't work as well, and I'll show you one of those later. And I was pretty happy with the compatibility out of the box. 99% of my library played as soon as I put it into the cartridge port and it dumped the ROM, and I had no issues. Now, your mileage may vary. You may find some games that don't work with the system. But again, I'm pretty pleased with it. So as a firmware version 2, I would say the compatibility is pretty good. Initially, I know they had some issues with some games, but again, in my experience, it was pretty okay. Hopefully they'll continue to update the firmware and improve the compatibility, and that's something they can definitely do in the future. As far as emulation quality goes, by far the most problems I had were with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. For whatever reason, I experienced glitches, and in a couple cases, the games just completely froze. And I feel like, if your bar is playing on the Super Game Boy, playing on the RetroN 5 is not necessarily going to live up to those standards. That being said, a lot of them played just fine. Like Metroid 2 here played just fine. But it's not exactly the same as playing, if you already have like a Game Boy player for your GameCube, or you have a Super Game Boy, I would suggest, just sticking with those, because it's just a far better experience than playing on the RetroN 5. But, if you don't have those things and you want to play on an HD TV, the RetroN 5 is certainly a serviceable solution. It's not bad. It's just, the few problems that I definitely had playing those systems. Now, let's check out Cannon Fodder, and you'll see what happens when this loads. It is completely glitchy, and it plays this really high-pitched, like, just noise, basically, the entire time it played. It was just not right at all. And do you hear that? That's what I'm talking about. The quality of the emulation for this particular game wasn't there, and a couple of other ones that I played. But so like I said earlier, your mileage is going to vary. I don't have near to complete collections for anything, so my compatibility tests were only for the games that I own. And like I said, for the most part, all of them work, but maybe you have some multi-carts that don't work or something like that. And in that case, maybe you wouldn't be as satisfied with the RetroN 5. But, in my experience, again, most everything worked fine, so, I didn't have any problems with it. Let's take a look at a Game Boy Advance game real quick, just to round it out. Let's have a look at Capcom Classics Mini Mix for the Game Boy Advance. Pretty cool little cartridge here. It has 3 games on it. Mighty Final Fight, Bionic Commando, and Strider. For the NES, it's probably the cheapest way to play Mighty Final Fight on an actual console without buying the cartridge for the NES, which goes for $100 now, I believe. You can also buy it on Wii and Wii U's Virtual Console, but I think this is a pretty cool little package. Anyway, we'll check out Bionic Commando just to see what it looks like. And as you can see, pretty clean, plays just fine. So, I think the RetroN 5, a pretty good solution for playing Game Boy Advance games on an HD TV if you don't have the Game Boy player. Again, but the emulation was a little spotty with the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. So if you've got a large collection of those, maybe not play them on the RetroN 5. Maybe get a Super Game Boy, because that seems to work much better. Alright, let's talk about my favorite feature of the RetroN 5, and it's one I think not nearly enough people are talking about. That's the ability to play English translated games by patching the ROMs on the RetroN 5. Now, as you can see, I just put in a copy of Super Mario RPG for the Super Famicom. I can't read any Japanese, but after the game is loaded, I can go into the game menu here, go to game-specific settings, and apply a patch. And what this does is this allows you to be able to play the English version of Super Mario RPG, despite the fact that I'm playing a Super Famicom cartridge, which is normally going to be in Japanese. Now, you could say, well, why don't you just emulate it or, play it on your computer in English or whatever. And I think that, that's fine if you want to do that. I'm not going to discourage anybody from, playing Super Mario RPG, on the Wii Virtual Console or playing it on your PC, whatever you want to do, that's fine. But for me, I think it's a cool way to be able to play the actual cartridges that I own. And in a lot of cases, you can get these RPGs that, you know, are normally hundreds of dollars here in the United States. You can buy the Super Famicom versions for, you know, $10, $20, something like that. So it feels a little more legit. It allows you to be able to play the game in English, which you're going to want to do anyway, and you can own it, which I think is pretty cool. It gives you a way to, you know, own Super Mario RPG, which is, you know, a few bucks over in Japan, but over here, you know, it's 50 or 60 bucks. And it's a cool little feature of the RetroN 5 that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. Pretty neat. Let's take a look at Chrono Trigger, another instance of, you know, a Super Famicom cartridge that I own that, you know, again, I can't read Japanese, but I can play it on the RetroN 5 if it's patched to play English. And again, it looks beautiful in upscaled 720p on my HD TV. So, you know, all the more reason, I think, to pick up a RetroN 5 if you love Japanese RPGs and you want to be able to play them. Like things like Bahamut Lagoon, for instance, never came over here to the States, but you can play the English patch ROM on your RetroN 5. So, you know, I think that's just such a cool feature. It's definitely a feature worth checking out if you already own a RetroN 5 or you're thinking about picking one up. And making the patches to apply to the ROMs are very, very easy. There are plenty of tutorials online and videos here on YouTube you can check out. Of course, if you want to play those Super Famicom carts on your actual Super Nintendo, it's very easy to do as well. You just take a pair of pliers and snip out the little pieces of plastic in there, and you're good to go. But again, they're going to be in Japanese. There is one more feature worth mentioning, and that is the ability to back up battery saves from your cartridges to the RetroN 5 and write them back to the cartridges. And while this mostly worked as advertised for me, I did run into some problems with having the saves written back to the cartridges, and in one case, it actually deleted the save from my cartridge altogether, so be careful with this feature. Let's really quickly take a look at the controller that comes with the RetroN 5. It has a micro switch D-pad, which feels okay, not unlike the Neo Geo CD, but the rest of the controller feels really shoddy. The build quality is not that great, and ergonomically it does not feel comfortable in your hands. So what do I think of the RetroN 5? Well, I think if you're a purist, you're probably not going to like this console very much because, after all, it is emulation, and it's just not the same as plugging in a cartridge into a Super Nintendo and playing it that way. However, if you're looking for more convenience and something that takes up a lot less shelf space, I think the RetroN 5 is a great solution. I get to play a lot of the Japanese RPGs I wouldn't normally get to play, and it feels a little more legit than just emulating it. However, it's really going to depend on the individual and what you prefer. So, should you run out and get a RetroN 5? Well, I think if you prefer convenience and you like playing Japanese RPGs, absolutely, it's a great purchase for $130 or sometimes even cheaper if you can find it on sale. However, if you prefer an authentic retro gaming experience, the RetroN 5's probably not for you. Well, that's it for episode 20 of Retro Buyer's Guide. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back in a week with a new episode. Till then, take care.